The year was 1982, and the city of New York was preparing for one of the biggest classical music competitions in the world. Musicians from every corner of the globe were flying in with their instruments, their dreams, and their years of hard practice. The competition was famous because it had the power to change lives. Winners would get recording contracts, concert tour, and instant fame. Losers would go home with nothing but broken hearts and empty hands. In a small apartment in Tokyo, Japan, a 12-year-old girl named was packing her violin case. Her mother watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes. They had very little money. Their apartment was tiny, with barely enough room for a bed and a small table. But in the corner stood something precious, a beautiful violin that had been playing since she was 3 years old. Was not like other children her age. While her classmates played games and watched television, she spent 8 hours every day practicing her violin. Her small fingers would move across the strings until they bled. Her mother would bandage them at night and would practice again the next morning. Music was not just a hobby for this young girl. It was her entire life, her breath, her heartbeat. The journey to America was long and exhausting, and her mother sat in the cheapest seats on the airplane, eating simple rice balls they had packed from home. They could not afford the expensive food served on the plane. As they flew over the Pacific Ocean, held her violin case close to her chest like a mother holding a baby. She whispered to it, promising that together they would show the world what they could do. When they landed in New York, everything was different from Japan. The buildings were taller, the people were louder, and everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Felt small and invisible in this giant city. People rushed past her without a second glance. Nobody knew that this tiny girl with the worn-out shoes and the old violin case was about to make history. The competition was held in a grand concert hall with golden walls and red velvet seats. Hundreds of musicians had come from Europe, America, Russia, and Asia. Most of them were adults in their 20s and 30s, with expensive suits and even more expensive instruments. They looked at Little with confusion. Some of them laughed behind their hands. What was a child doing here? This was a serious competition for serious musicians, not a playground for little girls. The American judges sat at a long table in the front row. They were famous musicians and critics who had heard thousands of performances in their lifetimes. They had seen everything and were impressed by nothing. Their faces were cold and expressionless as they looked at the list of performers. When they saw his name, one of them raised an eyebrow. Another one actually laughed out loud. "A 12-year-old from Japan," he said to his colleague. "What is this, a joke? She probably cannot even hold the violin properly. These Asian parents push their children too hard. It is sad, really." The other judge nodded in agreement. "Let her play for 2 minutes. We will be polite. Then we will move on to the real musicians." His mother heard these words. She understood enough English to know what they meant. Her heart broke into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to grab her daughter and run away from this cruel place. But when she looked she saw something that stopped her. There was no fear in her daughter's eyes. There was only calm determination, like a warrior before battle. "Mama," said softly, "they do not know me yet, but they will." The hours passed slowly as musician after musician took the stage. Some played beautifully, and some made mistakes. The judges wrote notes and whispered to each other. The audience clapped politely but without real enthusiasm. It was all very formal and very boring. Finally, the announcer called his name. The audience murmured in surprise when they saw her walk onto the stage. She was so small that she could barely be seen behind the music stand. Her dress was simple and plain compared to the elegant gowns of the other performers. Her shoes were old and slightly too big for her feet. She looked like a lost child who had wandered into the wrong building. The judges exchanged knowing looks. This would be quick. They were already thinking about their dinner plans. Walked to the center of the stage and bowed deeply, the Japanese way. Then she lifted her violin to her shoulder. For a moment she stood completely still. The entire concert hall fell silent. Even the people who had been whispering stopped talking. There was something about this girl, something in the way she held herself, that demanded attention. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In her mind, she was not in a fancy concert hall in America. She was back in her tiny apartment in Tokyo, playing for her mother, playing for the neighbors who complained about the noise, playing for everyone who had ever doubted her. She thought about all the nights she had cried from exhaustion. She thought about all the mornings she had woken up with fingers too sore to bend. She thought about every sacrifice her mother had made to give her this chance. Then she began to play. The first note that came from her violin was not a sound. It was a feeling. It traveled through the air like electricity and struck every person in the room directly in the heart. The judges, who had been looking at their watches, suddenly froze. Their eyes went wide. Their mouths fell open. Was playing a piece by one of the most difficult compositions ever written for violin. It was a piece that made grown men sweat and tremble. It was a piece that required not just technical skill, but also deep emotional maturity. How could a child possibly understand such music? But understood. She understood because she had lived through pain and struggle that most adults would never experience. Her small fingers flew across the strings with impossible speed and perfect accuracy. Her bow danced and jumped, creating sounds that seemed to come from another world. She played with her eyes closed, lost in the music, unaware of the tears that were now falling from the eyes of the judges. The same judge who had laughed was now weeping. He could not believe what he was hearing. In his 50 years of listening to music, he had never experienced anything like this. This was not just playing. This was magic. This was a miracle happening right in front of his eyes. The audience sat in stunned silence, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell that this tiny girl had cast over them all. The music filled every corner of the grand concert hall. It climbed up the golden walls and wrapped around the crystal chandeliers. It seeped into the hearts of every person present, breaking down walls they had built around their emotions over many years. Strong men who had not cried since childhood found tears streaming down their faces. Women clutched their chests as if their hearts might burst from the beauty of what they were hearing. Continued to play, her small body swaying gently with the music. She was no longer a 12-year-old girl standing on a stage. She had transformed into something else entirely. She was the violin, and the violin was her. There was no separation between the instrument and the musician. They had become one single being, creating sounds that seemed impossible for human hands to produce. In the audience, a famous music critic named Robert Sherman sat in complete disbelief. He had written reviews for the New York Times for over 30 years. He had heard the greatest musicians of his generation perform in the finest concert halls around the world. He thought he had heard everything. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But this little girl from Japan had just shattered everything he believed about music. He grabbed his notebook and tried to write, but his hand was shaking too much. The words would not come. How could he possibly describe what he was witnessing? There were no words in any language that could capture this moment. He finally gave up and just sat there, listening, letting the music wash over him like waves crashing on a shore. Meanwhile, backstage, the other competitors had gathered near the curtain to watch. They had come to see the little Japanese girl make a fool of herself. They had expected to laugh and feel better about their own performances. Instead, they stood frozen in shock and shame. One by one, they realized that they had just been shown what true musical genius looked like, and it was humbling beyond words. A Russian violinist named, who was 28 years old and had been playing since he was 5, dropped his bow on the floor. He did not bother to pick it up. What was the point? He had spent 23 years of his life practicing every single day. He had studied at the best conservatories in Moscow and Vienna. He had won smaller competitions and received praise from his teachers. But in this moment, watching this child play, he understood that he would never reach her level. Not in 10 years. Not in 100 years. She had something that could not be taught or learned. She had a gift from the heavens. His mother stood in the wings with her hands pressed together in prayer. Tears poured down her face, But she made no sound. She did not want to disturb her daughter's concentration. She watched as her little girl poured her entire soul into the music, and she remembered all the years of struggle that had led to this moment. Remembered the day she first discovered Gift. Was only 2 years old, and they were listening to a classical music program on their old radio. Suddenly, the toddler began to hum along perfectly with the melody. Not just the main tune, but the complex harmonies underneath. Thought she was imagining things. A 2-year-old could not possibly understand such complicated music. But when she tested again the next day, and the day after that, she realized that her daughter was special. From that moment on, dedicated her entire life to nurturing's talent. She worked 3 jobs to pay for violin lessons and instruments. She went without food so that could have new strings and sheet music. She sold everything they owned except the bare essentials. People called her crazy. Family members told her she was wasting her life on a foolish dream, but knew in her heart that her daughter was destined for greatness. And now, standing in the wings of this magnificent concert hall in America, watching her child create magic with a wooden instrument and 4 strings, knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Every hungry night, every cold winter without heat, every moment of doubt and despair, it had all led to this. Her baby was showing the world that dreams do come true, even for poor little girls from Japan with nothing but talent and determination. On stage reached the most difficult section of the piece. Her fingers moved so fast that they became a blur. The bow seemed to have a life of its own, dancing and leaping across the strings. She hit every note with perfect precision, never faltering, never hesitating. The music built and built, climbing higher and higher like a bird soaring toward the sun. The head judge, a stern German man named Weber, had not moved a single muscle since began playing. He had been a concert violinist himself before becoming a judge, and he knew exactly how difficult this piece was. He had attempted to play it himself when he was young and had failed miserably. He had watched many accomplished musicians try and struggle. But this child, this tiny girl who barely reached his chest, was playing it as if it were a simple nursery rhyme. Thought about all the young musicians he had dismissed over the years. He thought about all the harsh words he had written in his reviews, destroying dreams with a single sentence. He had always believed that he was serving music by maintaining high standards, but watching play, he realized that he had become cold and cynical. He had forgotten why he fell in love with music in the first place. He had forgotten that music was supposed to make you feel something. This little girl had just reminded him. She had reached into his chest and grabbed his heart and squeezed it until he felt emotions he thought had died long ago. He felt joy and sadness and hope and longing all at the same time. He felt alive for the first time in years. The other judges were having similar revelations. They looked at each other with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Without saying a word, they all understood that they were witnessing something historic. They were witnessing the birth of a legend. Someday, they would tell there about this night. They would say that they were there when first showed the world her extraordinary gift. As the piece moved toward its climax, the entire audience seemed to lean forward as one. They were holding their breath, afraid that if they made any sound, the spell would be broken. The music swirled around them like a storm, powerful and beautiful and terrifying all at once. His face showed complete concentration, but also something else. She was smiling slightly, the way someone smiles when they are doing exactly what they were born to do. In the cheap seats at the back of the hall, a young boy named David sat with his parents. He was 10 years old and had been taking violin lessons for 2 years. He hated practicing. He complained every day and begged his parents to let him quit. But watching play, something changed inside him. He suddenly understood what music could be. He suddenly saw what was possible if you dedicated yourself completely to something you loved. He tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered, "Dad, I want to practice more. I want to play like her." His father looked down at him with tears in his eyes and nodded. In that moment had changed another life without even knowing it. She had planted a seed of inspiration that would grow for years to come. This was the true power of art. It did not just entertain. It transformed. It elevated. It showed people what human beings were capable of achieving. The music continued to build, and everyone in the hall felt something extraordinary was about to happen. The final notes of the piece hung in the air like stars suspended in a night sky, held her bow perfectly still, letting the last vibration fade naturally into silence. For a moment that felt like eternity, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The concert hall was wrapped in a blanket of absolute stillness. Then the silence shattered. The audience erupted in an explosion of applause that shook the walls of the building. People jumped to their feet so fast that chairs fell over behind them. They clapped and cheered and screamed with a passion that the concert hall had never witnessed before. Some people were crying openly, not bothering to wipe their tears. Others were laughing with pure joy, the way people laugh when they cannot believe what they have just seen. The judges stood up together, something they never did for any performer. They applauded with their hands high above their heads, wanting to see how deeply she had moved them. Weber, the stern German judge who had not smiled in years, was clapping so hard that his palms turned red. The judge who had laughed its name on the list was now sobbing like a baby, repeating over and over, "Forgive me, forgive me." Lowered her violin and bowed deeply, the traditional Japanese way of showing respect. When she raised her head, there was no pride or arrogance in her eyes. There was only gratitude and humility. She was genuinely surprised by the reaction. In her mind, she had simply played the music as she always did. She did not understand why everyone was acting so strangely. Backstage, her mother collapsed into a chair, completely overwhelmed with emotion. The years of struggle, the poverty, the doubts, the criticism, everything came rushing back to her in that moment. She had bet everything on her daughter's talent, and now the world was finally seeing what she had always known. Her baby was extraordinary. The other competitors watched from the wings in various states of shock. Some of them applauded genuinely, recognizing and respecting true talent when they saw it. Others stood with their arms crossed, jealousy burning in their chests. How could they compete against this? How could they possibly follow a performance like that? The Russian violinist walked away from the curtain and sat down on a wooden crate. He put his head in his hands and sat there for a long time, thinking about his life and his choices. He was not angry at the little girl. He was angry at himself for never finding that level of passion in his own playing. He had spent his entire life treating music like a job, something to be done correctly and efficiently, but had shown him that music was supposed to be so much more than that. The standing ovation continued for nearly 10 minutes. People did not want to stop clapping because stopping would mean accepting that the moment was over. They wanted to hold on to this feeling forever. Some audience members started chanting her name, and soon the entire hall was echoing with her name bouncing off the walls like a beautiful song. Finally, the announcer had to come on stage and ask everyone to please take their seats. There were still other performers to come. The competition had to continue, but everyone knew that the competition was already over. Nobody could possibly match what they had just witnessed. The other musicians were simply playing for second place now. Walked off the stage and immediately found her mother waiting for her, wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her tight, not caring who was watching. Mother and daughter stood there in the dim backstage light, holding each other, two souls who had been through so much together. No words were needed. They had already said everything through the music. A competition official approached them nervously. He was a young man in an expensive suit, and he looked very uncomfortable. "Excuse me," he said in English. "The judges would like to speak with Miss after the competition ends. Is that all right?" Looked at her daughter and nodded. "Yes," replied in her careful English. "We will wait." The remaining hours of the competition felt like days. Performer after performer took the stage, each one talented in their own way. But the audience was distracted. They kept glancing at the wing where had disappeared, hopping to catch another glimpse of the magical girl. They clapped politely for the other musicians, but their hearts were no longer in it. The judges tried their best to remain fair and objective. They wrote their notes and discussed each performance professionally. But in private moments when they thought nobody was watching, they would shake their heads in disbelief, still trying to process what had done to them. She had changed something inside them, and they did not know if they would ever be the same. When the last performer finished, the audience applauded with relief. Now they could find out what they already knew. Now they could celebrate the little Japanese girl officially. The judges retreated to a private room to make their final decision, though everyone knew it was just a formality. Meanwhile, backstage, something unexpected was happening. Several of the other competitors had gathered around not to confront her but to learn from her. They asked her questions about her technique, her practice routine, her approach to music. They treated her not like a rival, but like a master teacher, even though she was decades younger than most of them. Answered their questions patiently and humbly. She did not boast about her performance or act superior. She spoke about music with the same innocent enthusiasm she had when she first picked up a violin as a toddler. She told them about her daily practice, about the hours of scales and exercises, about the times she felt like giving up. She was honest about her struggles, and this made the other musicians respect her even more. One competitor, a French woman named, asked the question everyone wanted to know. How do you do it? How do you play with so much emotion? It is like you feel every single note in your body. Thought about the question for a long moment. Then she said something that would remember for the rest of her life. I do not think about the audience when I play. I do not think about the judges or the competition. I think about the people I love. I think about my mother. I think about the people who cannot hear music because they are sick or suffering. I play for them. I try to send them a message through the music. I try to tell them that they are not alone. The French woman nodded slowly, understanding something profound. Was not just a technical genius. She was an emotional genius too. She had found the secret that so many musicians spend their whole lives searching for. She had learned how to connect her heart directly to her instrument, bypassing all the barriers and fears that hold most people back. Outside the building, news of performance was already spreading through the city. Musicians who had not attended the competition were calling each other on the phone, asking if the rumors were true. Had a 12-year-old Japanese girl really outplayed all the professional musicians? It sounded impossible. It sounded like a fairy tale. But those who had been there confirmed it was real. By morning, the entire classical music world would know her name. By next week, she would be on the cover of every music magazine. But for now, in this quiet moment backstage, she was just a little girl sitting on the floor with her violin case beside her, waiting to hear if she had won. Her mother brought her a simple rice ball, the same kind they had eaten on the airplane. Ate it gratefully, not caring that the other competitors were eating fancy catered food nearby. She had learned long ago that the simple things in life were often the sweetest. A rice ball made by her mother was worth more than all the gourmet meals in the world. The judges finally emerged from their meeting room, and everyone gathered in the main hall for the announcement. The main hall buzzed with nervous energy as everyone gathered for the announcement. Musicians stood in clusters, whispering predictions and making last-minute prayers. The audience members who had stayed to witness the results leaned forward in their seats, eager to confirm what they already believed in their hearts. Stood near the back of the group, holding her mother's hand. She did not push to the front or try to position herself for the cameras that had gathered near the stage. She simply waited quietly, her violin case clutched against her side like a loyal companion. Weber, the head judge, walked slowly to the microphone. His face was serious, but there was something different about his eyes. They had a warmth that people who knew him had never seen before. He cleared his throat and looked out at the assembled crowd. In my 40 years of judging competitions, he began, his German accent thick with emotion, I have heard many talented musicians. I have given prizes to men and women who went on to have successful careers. I have always believed that I could recognize excellence when I heard it. He paused and took a deep breath. The room was completely silent. Tonight, I learned that I knew nothing. Tonight, I was taught a lesson by a 12-year-old girl from Japan. What she did on this stage was not just excellent. It was otherworldly. It was the kind of music that comes along once in a generation, maybe once in a century. The other judges nodded in agreement. Some of them wiped tears from their eyes, not ashamed to show their emotions publicly. The judges have voted unanimously, continued. This has never happened before in the history of this competition. Usually, we argue for hours, sometimes days. But tonight, there was no argument. There was no debate. There was only one name on every ballot. He turned to look directly at, who seemed to shrink smaller under his gaze. Please come forward. The crowd erupted in cheers before he could even announce that she had won. People pushed aside to make a path for her, reaching out to touch her shoulders and pat her back as she walked past. She moved forward slowly, still holding her mother's hand, pulling along with her to share in the moment. When they reached the stage, knelt down to be at eye level with. This proud, serious man who had intimidated musicians for decades was now kneeling before a child, treating her with the respect usually reserved for royalty. Miss, he said softly so only she could hear, I owe you an apology. Before you played tonight, I laughed at your name. I thought you were too young, too inexperienced, too different to compete here. I was a fool. You have shown me that genius has no age, no nationality, no background. You have reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Thank you. Bowed to him, accepting his apology with grace beyond her years. Thank you, sir, she replied in English. I am happy if my music touched your heart. He stood up and addressed the crowd again. Ladies and it is my great honor to announce the winner of the 1982 International Violin Competition. For the first time in history, the prize goes to a performer under the age of 15. Please congratulate Miss. The applause that followed was even louder than the standing ovation after her performance. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks. Journalists rushed forward, shouting questions in multiple languages. The other competitors applauded sincerely, most of them having made peace with their defeat. A beautiful trophy was placed in small hands. It was almost too heavy for her to hold. Her mother helped her support it while photographers captured the moment from every angle, smiled shyly, still not fully understanding the magnitude of what she had accomplished. After the official ceremony, the journalists finally got their chance to interview her. They surrounded her with microphones and notepads, firing questions faster than she could possibly answer. How does it feel to be the youngest winner in the history of this competition? What will you do with the prize money? Do you have a message for other young musicians? What did you think of the American judges? Answered each question thoughtfully and politely. When asked about her future plans, she said simply, I want to keep practicing. I have much to learn. When asked about the judges, she said, they are very kind people. I am grateful for their attention. But the most powerful moment came when a young reporter asked about her mother. What role has your mother played in your success? Turned to look at, who was standing quietly behind her, trying to stay out of the spotlight. Her eyes filled with tears as she answered. My mother has given me everything. She worked very hard so I could take lessons. She went hungry so I could have new strings for my violin. She believed in me when nobody else did. This prize belongs to her more than to me. The cameras immediately turned to who covered her face with embarrassment. She was not used to attention. She had spent her whole life in the shadows, supporting her daughter from behind the scenes. But now the world was seeing her, recognizing her sacrifice, honoring her devotion. Mother and daughter embraced on stage, surrounded by flashing cameras and cheering crowds. It was a moment that would be reproduced in newspapers and magazines around the world. The image of this poor Japanese mother and her talented daughter became a symbol of hope for parents everywhere who struggled to support their children's dreams. After the interviews finally ended and were escorted to a fancy hotel that the competition organizers had arranged, they had never stayed in such a luxurious place. The room had a king-sized bed with silk sheets, a marble bathroom with golden fixtures, and a view of the New York skyline that took their breath away. Ran to the window and pressed her face against the glass like any normal 12-year-old would. "Mama, look at all the lights. It is like 1,000 stars on the ground." Smiled and joined her daughter at the window. They stood there together, looking out at the city that had just crowned their dreams. Tomorrow there would be more interviews, more photographs, more attention. But tonight, they could simply be a mother and daughter enjoying a beautiful view. "Are you happy?" asked softly. Thought about the question carefully. "I am grateful," she said, "but I am most happy because you are happy. When I saw you crying in the audience, I played better. I wanted to make those tears worth something." Pulled her daughter close. "You have already made everything worth something. From the day you were born, you have been my greatest joy. This prize is just the world finally seeing what I have always known." They ordered room service for dinner, something they had never done in their lives. When the food arrived on silver trays with white cloth napkins, they giggled like children at a tea party. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, knowing that their lives were about to change in ways they could not yet imagine. Outside their window, the city of New York sparkled and hummed with energy. Somewhere in that vast urban jungle, newspaper editors were rushing to print tomorrow's headlines. Music critics were typing their reviews, struggling to find words magnificent enough to describe what they had witnessed. And in homes across the country, families were tucking their children into bed, unaware that by morning they would all know the name of a little girl from Japan who had dared to dream bigger than anyone thought possible. The morning after the competition woke up to a world that had completely transformed. When she and her mother stepped out of the hotel, they were greeted by a crowd of reporters and photographers who had been waiting since dawn. Security guards had to escort them to a waiting car, shielding them from the flashing cameras and shouting voices. The newspapers were filled with her story. Every major publication in America had her picture on the front page. Headlines screamed words like "Miracle Child" and "The Girl Who Made Judges Cry" and "A Star Is Born." Television news programs played clips of her performance and showed interviews with audience members who still could not believe what they had witnessed. In Japan, the reaction was even more intense. The news arrived in the early morning hours, and by lunchtime, was the most famous person in the country. People who had never listened to classical music in their lives were suddenly talking about this remarkable little girl who had conquered America. Schools held special assemblies to discuss her achievement. Parents pointed to her example when encouraging their children to practice their instruments. But amidst all the celebration, remained surprisingly unchanged. While the world went crazy around her, she continued to wake up early every morning to practice her scales. She still ate simple meals and helped her mother clean their hotel room. She still bowed deeply to everyone she met and said thank you for even the smallest kindness. This humility puzzled many of the American journalists who followed her story. They were used to celebrities who demanded special treatment and threw tantrums when things did not go their way. But this child was different. She seemed genuinely uninterested in fame and attention. All she cared about was music. One reporter asked her directly, "You are now famous all over the world. How does that make you feel?" Thought for a moment before answering. "I do not feel different inside. I am still the same girl who practices violin every day. The fame belongs to the music, not to me. I am just the person who carries the music from one place to another." This answer was quoted in newspapers everywhere. People were amazed by the wisdom coming from someone so young. Psychologists wrote articles trying to explain her unusual maturity. Music teachers used her as an example of how dedication could lead to greatness. She had become more than a violinist. She had become a symbol. Within weeks, offers began pouring in from every direction. Record labels wanted her to sign exclusive contracts. Concert halls around the world invited her to perform. Famous conductors requested the honor of working with her. Television shows begged for interviews. Companies offered millions of dollars for her to endorse their products. Was overwhelmed by all the attention. She had never dealt with contracts and negotiations before. She was a simple woman who had worked as a cleaner and a seamstress to support her daughter's dream. Now suddenly, she was being asked to make decisions that would affect millions of dollars and shape her daughter's entire future. Fortunately, help arrived in the form of a kind manager named Lei. Was a legendary violin teacher who had trained many of the world's greatest musicians. She had seen performance at the competition and had immediately recognized that this child was special beyond anything she had encountered before. Offered to help Guide's career without taking advantage of her. She understood that this young girl needed protection from the harsh realities of the entertainment industry. She helped review contracts and reject offers that were not in best interest. She insisted that education and must always come before money and fame. This child has a gift that comes along once in a lifetime, told. Our job is not to exploit that gift. Our job is to nurture it, protect it, and help it grow. If we do this right, she will be playing beautiful music for the next 60 years. If we do it wrong, she will burn out before she turns 20. Trusted immediately. Here was someone who understood that was not just a money-making machine. She was a child, a human being with feelings and needs and limits. Together, the three of them formed a team that would Guide's career for many years to come. The first major decision they made was to move to America. Explained that the best opportunities for a classical musician were in the United States. She offered to teach herself at a famous music school in New York. She promised to treat not just as a student, but as the extraordinary talent she was. Leaving Japan was hard for her. They had to say goodbye to their tiny apartment, their neighbors, their friends, and everything familiar. His family begged her not to go, warning that America was too different, too dangerous for a Japanese woman alone with a young child, but knew that this was the right choice. She had already sacrificed so much for her daughter's dream. She would sacrifice even more. They arrived in New York with 2 suitcases and a violin case, met them at the airport and took them to a small apartment near the music school. It was bigger and nicer than their home in Tokyo, but it still felt strange and foreign. The sounds were different. The smells were different. Even the air felt different on their skin. Started school the next week, attending regular classes in the morning and taking violin lessons in the afternoon. The other students treated her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They had heard about her famous performance and wanted to know what she was really like. Was she stuck up? Was she a prodigy robot with no personality? Was she as amazing in person as she was on stage? They quickly discovered that was just a normal kid who happened to play violin exceptionally well. She laughed at jokes and struggled with math homework and got nervous before tests just like everyone else. She made friends slowly, her English still limited, but her genuine kindness broke through all language barriers. One classmate, a girl named Jennifer, became her closest friend. Jennifer played piano and understood the pressures of being a young musician. She helped with her English and introduced her to American customs like pizza and baseball and Saturday morning cartoons. In return, taught Jennifer some Japanese words and shared her mother's homemade rice balls. For the first time in her life, felt like she had a normal childhood. Yes, she still practiced violin for many hours every day. Yes, she still had to perform in concerts and deal with publicity. But she also had sleepovers and birthday parties and silly arguments about who was the boy in class. She was learning how to be both a prodigy and a regular kid. Her mother watched this transformation with joy and relief. She had always worried that the intense focus on violin had stolen her childhood. She had feared that her daughter would grow up isolated and lonely, unable to relate to people her own age. But now, seeing Giggle with Jennifer over a comic book, She knew that everything would be okay. The music continued to flow from like water from a spring. Her lessons with pushed her to even greater heights. She learned new techniques, new pieces, new ways of expressing emotion through her instrument. Every performance was better than the last, and the world continued to marvel at this girl who seemed to have no limits. But knew that she had limits. She knew that she was still learning, still growing, still making mistakes. She knew that the music inside her was bigger than what she could currently express, and she knew that she had a long journey ahead before she could become the musician she wanted to be. This knowledge kept her humble even as the world her talent. She never forgot where she came from or the sacrifices her mother had made. And she never stopped practicing, never stopped learning, never stopped reaching for the stars. 3 years had passed since the competition that changed everything. Was now 15 years old, taller and more confident, but still carrying that same innocent love for music that had captivated the world. She had performed in concert halls across Europe, Asia, and America. She had played for presidents and prime ministers, for movie stars and business leaders. Her name was known in every country where classical music was appreciated. But the most important moment of her young career was still ahead. The invitation arrived on a cool autumn morning. A letter with the seal of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra requested its presence as a featured soloist at their annual gala concert. This was not just any concert. This was the most prestigious event in the classical music calendar. The greatest musicians in the world considered it an honor to be invited, and now they were inviting a 15-year-old girl. The conductor of the orchestra was the legendary, a master whose name alone could fill concert halls. He had watched recordings of performances and had become fascinated by her unusual combination of technical perfection and emotional depth. He believed that she was ready for the biggest stage in classical music. He wanted to introduce her to the world in a way that would cement her legacy forever. The piece they would perform together was Serenade, a fiercely difficult composition that demanded absolute precision and incredible stamina. It was a piece that many adult musicians avoided because of its complexity, but was convinced that could handle it. More than that, he believed she could transform it into something magical. Spent months preparing for the concert. She practiced the piece until every note was engraved in her muscle memory. She studied recordings of the greatest violinists playing the same composition, analyzing what made each interpretation unique. She worked to strengthen the areas where she felt weakest. By the time the concert date arrived, she knew the piece better than she knew her own reflection. The night of the gala concert was hot and humid, unusual for late summer in New York. The concert hall was packed with the most important people in the music world. Critics who could make or break careers sat in the front rows with their notebooks ready. Famous musicians who had performed on the same stage watched from the wings, curious to see if the young phenomenon could deliver under pressure. Walked onto the stage wearing an elegant white dress that her mother had sewn by hand. The audience applauded warmly as she took her position next to. He smiled at her kindly, a gesture of support and confidence. Then he raised his baton, and the orchestra began to play. The first movement went beautifully. His violin sang above the orchestra like a bird soaring over a forest. Her fingers danced across the strings with the ease of someone born to do exactly this. The audience settled into their seats, relaxed and happy, expecting a flawless performance. Then disaster struck. In the middle of the second movement, during one of the most technically demanding passages, one of his violin strings snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The string whipped through the air, barely missing her face. The music stuttered and stumbled as struggled to continue playing on only 3 strings. The audience gasped in horror. This was every musician's nightmare. A broken string during a major performance could destroy a career. Most musicians would stop, apologize, and ask for a moment to fix the problem. Some would simply walk off the stage in shame. But did not stop. She did not hesitate for even a second. Without missing a beat, she adapted her fingering to compensate for the missing string. She played the next several measures on 3 strings, adjusting her technique on the fly, solving impossible musical problems in real time. The audience could not believe what they were seeing. This was not supposed to be possible. What she was doing was like a runner continuing a race on one leg. Watched with amazement and concern, he signaled for the concertmaster to hand his violin so she could switch instruments, grabbed the new violin without stopping her playing, transitioning seamlessly as if this was something she did every day. The music continued without interruption. But the nightmare was not over. A few minutes later, incredibly, another string on the second violin snapped. The same terrifying sound, the same whipping motion, the same impossible situation. The audience members looked at each other in disbelief. 2 broken strings in one performance. This had to be a cruel joke by fate. Once again did not stop. Once again she adapted and continued playing on 3 strings. Her face showed no panic, no fear, no frustration. There was only intense concentration and unwavering determination. She had come here to play music, and broken strings were not going to stop her. The concertmaster, now himself, scrambled to find another instrument. He finally located a third violin and carefully handed it to during a brief orchestral passage where she was not playing. She accepted it with a quick nod of thanks and launched back into the piece as if nothing had happened. By now, the audience was on the edge of their seats for an entirely different reason than they had expected. They were not just watching a concert anymore. They were witnessing a battle, a 15-year-old girl fighting against fate itself, refusing to surrender no matter how many obstacles were thrown in her way. The rest of the performance was flawless, played the third violin with the same brilliance she had shown from the beginning. The final movement built to an explosive climax, with violin soaring above the full power of the orchestra. When the last note faded into silence, the audience erupted with an ovation that exceeded even the one from her first competition. But this time, there was something different about the applause. There was more than admiration in the sound. There was profound respect, even wonder. These people had just witnessed something that would be talked about for decades. They had seen a young girl demonstrate courage, composure, and professionalism that would put most adults to shame. Took's hand and raised it high, presenting her to the audience like a champion. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked at this remarkable child. In his 50 years as a conductor, he had never seen anything like this. He had worked with the greatest musicians in the world, but none of them had shown this level of grace under pressure. Backstage was waiting with open arms. She had watched the entire incident from the wings, her heart stopping with each broken string. She had wanted to run onto the stage and protect her daughter from the chaos, but she had stayed where she was, trusting to handle the situation herself. "You did not stop," whispered into her daughter's hair. "You never stopped." Pulled back and smiled. "Mama, stopping was never an option. The music needed to be heard. The people needed to feel it. A broken string could not change that." The next morning, every newspaper in the world carried the story of incredible performance. Critics who had planned to write simple reviews found themselves writing epic tales of heroism and determination. The image of a 15-year-old girl refusing to let technical failures stop her music became a symbol of resilience for people everywhere. Musicians who had watched the performance told the story to their students for years afterward. "When things go wrong," they would say, remember that the music is bigger than any problem. Remember that a true artist never gives up." The legend of grew even larger that night. She was no longer just a talented violinist. She was proof that the human spirit could overcome any obstacle. The years following the gala concert brought fame and success beyond anything she could have imagined. Recording contracts worth millions of dollars landed on her doorstep. Concert halls competed fiercely for the honor of hosting her performances. Magazine covers featured her face month after month. She became not just a musician, but a cultural icon representing the power of talent and hard work. But with great success came great pressure. The expectations placed on young shoulders would have crushed most adults. Every performance had to be perfect. Every interview had to be flawless. Every public appearance had to maintain the image of the prodigy princess who could do no wrong. There was no room for mistakes, no space for being a normal teenager with normal problems. Began to feel the weight of these expectations pressing down on her. She was 17 now, going through all the confusing changes that teenagers experience. She wanted to go to parties and hang out with friends and worry about normal things like homework and boys. Instead, she spent her days in rehearsal rooms and recording studios, surrounded by adults who treated her like a product to be marketed rather than a person to be understood. The relationship with her mother also became complicated during this time, had devoted her entire life to career, sacrificing everything for her daughter's success, but now was growing up, wanting independence, needing space to discover who she was beyond the violin. These normal teenage desires clashed with protective instincts, creating tension that neither of them knew how to resolve. Small arguments became big arguments. Misunderstandings turned into hurt feelings. The closeness they had shared through all the years of struggle began to crack under the pressure of fame and adolescence. Sometimes resented her mother for the life she had been given, forgetting all the sacrifices that had made it possible. Sometimes pushed too hard, forgetting that her daughter was still a child who needed room to grow. The music, which had always been joy and escape, began to feel like a prison. She still played beautifully, still amazed audiences with her technical brilliance, but something was missing. The passion that had made her performances legendary was fading. She was going through the motions, hitting all the right notes without feeling them in her heart. Critics began to notice the change. Reviews that had once been unanimously glowing now contained subtle concerns. Technically perfect but emotionally distant, wrote one famous critic. Has the prodigy lost her spark? Asked another. These words hurt more than any broken string ever could. One night, after a particularly difficult performance, sat alone in her dressing room and cried. She cried for the childhood she had missed. She cried for the relationship with her mother that seemed to be slipping away. She cried for the love of music that she was afraid she had lost forever. She cried until there were no tears left, and then she sat in empty silence, wondering if all the fame and success had been worth the price she had paid. Found her there an hour later, still sitting in the dark. The wise teacher did not ask questions or offer advice. She simply sat down next to and held her hand, letting her know that she was not alone. They stayed like that for a long time, two souls connected by their love of music and their concern for each other. Finally spoke. You know, even the greatest musicians go through periods of doubt. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of growth. Your soul is telling you that something needs to change. But what? Asked, her voice hoarse from crying. I do not know who I am without the violin. I do not know what I want anymore. Smiled gently. Then perhaps it is time to find out. Perhaps you need to take a step back from performing and discover who is when she is not on stage. The idea was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Had never taken a break from music in her entire life. Since she was 3 years old, the violin had been her constant companion. The thought of putting it down, even temporarily, felt like cutting off a part of herself. But she knew was right. Something had to change or she would burn out completely. After many discussions with her mother and her management team, made a decision that shocked the music world. She announced that she would take a 1-year break from performing to focus on her education and personal growth. She enrolled in college, something she had never had time for before. She would study psychology and international relations, subjects that had nothing to do with music, but everything to do with understanding herself and the world. The announcement made headlines everywhere. Some people praised her bravery and self-awareness. Others criticized her for abandoning her gift and disappointing her fans. The debate raged in newspapers and on television, with everyone having an opinion about what should do with her life, but was not listening to the opinions of others anymore. For the first time, she was making a decision based on what she needed, not what the world expected from her. College was strange and wonderful and challenging in ways she had never experienced. She sat in classrooms with students her own age who knew nothing about her fame. They treated her like a normal person, teasing her about her studying habits and inviting her to parties and complaining about professors just like they did with everyone else. It was exactly what she needed. She made friends who did not care about her violin playing. She had conversations about philosophy and politics and movies and food. She stayed up late talking about nothing important and slept in on weekend mornings. She went on dates with boys who liked her for her smile, not her talent. She learned how to be young in a way she had never been allowed to be before. The break from performing also gave her time to heal her relationship with her mother. Distance and perspective helped both of them see their mistakes more clearly, realize that she had been holding on too tightly, afraid to let her daughter grow up, realize that her mother's protective instincts came from love, not control. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt their bond on a foundation of mutual respect and adult understanding. The violin sat in its case in the corner of dorm room. Sometimes she would look at it and feel nothing. Other times she would feel a sharp longing that surprised her with its intensity. She was learning to have a relationship with music on her own terms, not the terms dictated by audiences and critics and contracts. One spring evening, near the end of her year off, opened the violin case for the first time in months. She lifted the instrument to her shoulder and played a simple melody, something she remembered from childhood. The sound that emerged was rusty and uncertain, nothing like her legendary performances. But there was something else in the sound, something that had been missing for years. There was joy, pure, simple, uncomplicated joy. She was playing because she wanted to, not because she had to. She was playing for herself, not for audiences or critics or contracts. Tears streamed down her face as she continued to play, the melody growing stronger and more confident with each note. She had found her love of music again. It had been waiting patiently for her to come back, faithful as an old friend. The next chapter of her life was about to begin. Return to performing with a maturity and depth that astonished even those who had followed her career from the beginning. The year off had transformed her in ways that were immediately apparent the moment she stepped onto a stage. She was no longer the nervous prodigy seeking approval. She was a confident young woman who knew exactly why she was there and what she wanted to say through her music. Her comeback concert was held in the same hall where she had faced the broken strings years before. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. This was where she had proven her resilience as a teenager. Now, she was returning to prove her growth as an adult. The audience that night included many people who had been present at that legendary performance, eager to see what the break had done to her abilities. From the first note, it was clear that something remarkable had happened. The technical perfection was still there, every note precisely placed, every phrase beautifully shaped. But there was something new underneath the perfection. There was wisdom. There was experience. There was the kind of emotional truth that only comes from living through struggle and emerging stronger on the other side. Critics who had worried that the break might damage her skills were forced to eat their words. The reviews that followed were the most glowing of her entire career. Writers struggled to find new superlatives to describe what they had heard. They said her playing had depth that penetrated the soul and maturity beyond her years, and the rare quality of making each listener feel personally addressed. But was not interested in reviews anymore. She had learned during her year off that external validation was a shallow substitute for internal peace. She played now for reasons that had nothing to do with fame or money or critical approval. She played because music was how she made sense of the world, how she connected with other human beings, how she contributed something meaningful to a universe that often seemed chaotic and cruel. This new perspective led her to make another surprising decision. Instead of spending all her time in fancy concert halls playing for wealthy patrons, she wanted to bring music to people who would never have access to such performances. She wanted to use her gift to make a real difference in the lives of ordinary people, especially children who reminded her of her younger self. She founded an organization called And Friends, dedicated to bringing music education to children in communities. She personally visited schools in poor neighborhoods, carrying her million-dollar violin into gymnasiums and cafeterias, playing for kids who had never heard a live classical performance in their lives. She showed them that music was not just for rich people in fancy clothes. It belonged to everyone. The reactions of these children touched her heart in ways that standing ovations never had. She would see eyes widen with wonder when she demonstrated how many sounds could come from 4 simple strings. She would watch faces light up when she let children touch her violin and pluck the strings themselves. She would feel tiny hands grab hers with gratitude after she finished playing. One girl in particular changed understanding of why her work mattered. Her name was, and she was 9 years old, growing up in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than music. His father was in prison, her mother worked 3 jobs, and she spent most of her time alone or watching her younger siblings. When came to school, sat in the back row with her arms crossed, convinced that this fancy lady with the expensive instrument had nothing to offer her. But as began to play, something in's face softened. Her arms uncrossed. Her body leaned forward. By the end of the performance, tears were streaming down her young cheeks. After the concert, approached shyly. "Can I touch it?" she asked, pointing to the violin. Knelt down and placed the instrument in his hands, showing her how to hold it properly. Small fingers rested on the strings with surprising gentleness. "It is beautiful," whispered. "I never knew something could be so beautiful." "Would you like to learn to play?" asked. His eyes went wide. "I could never afford lessons, and my neighborhood does not have any music teachers." Smiled. "That is what my organization is for. We are going to bring violin teachers to your school. If you want to learn, you can. The only thing you need to bring is your dedication." True to her word, arranged for to receive free violin lessons through her program. Over the following months, she checked in on its progress, sending encouraging notes and sometimes making surprise visits to watch her play. Practiced with the same fierce determination that had driven as a child. She did not have extraordinary talent, but she had something just as valuable. She had passion and persistence and a desperate hunger for something beautiful in a life that had offered her very little beauty. Was just one of thousands of children whose lives were touched by charitable work. In schools across America and eventually around the world, children were discovering the joy of music thanks to programs that had created. Some of them went on to become professional musicians. Others simply carried the love of music with them into adulthood, passing it on to their own children someday. The humanitarian work brought a sense of fulfillment that performing alone had never provided. She continued to give concerts, still delighting audiences with her remarkable gift. But now she saw performing as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The money she earned funded her charitable programs. The fame she generated raised awareness for music education. Her talent had become a tool for making the world a better place. Her relationship with her mother evolved beautifully during this time. Now older and more relaxed, became involved in the charitable work as well. She helped manage the logistics of school visits and fundraising events. She used her experience of poverty to connect with the families of children in the programs. Mother and daughter were no longer bound together by the intense pressure of building a career. They were united now by a shared mission that gave both their lives meaning. Often thought about how far they had come. The journey from that tiny apartment in Tokyo to this international organization helping thousands of children seemed impossible when she looked back on it. There had been so many moments when giving up would have been easier, so many times when the obstacles seemed insurmountable, but they had never given up, and now they could see the beautiful results of their perseverance. One evening, while they were organizing supplies for a school visit, said something that would remember forever. "I used to think that my greatest achievement was helping you become a famous violinist," said. "But now I know that was wrong. My greatest achievement was raising a daughter who uses her gift to help others. The fame and the money and the awards, they mean nothing compared to that." Embraced her mother, feeling the same love and gratitude that had fueled her playing since childhood. They had been through so much together. They had faced doubt and poverty and pressure and international fame, and through it all, their bond had remained unbroken. The little girl who had packed her violin in Tokyo all those years ago had become a woman who was changing the world, one child at a time. Decades had passed since the 12-year-old girl from Tokyo first stepped onto the stage in New York and silenced the laughing judges. Was now in her 50s, her black hair streaked with silver, her face marked by the wisdom that comes from a life fully lived. She had performed in every major concert hall on every continent. She had won every prize the classical music world had to offer. She had been named a United Nations Messenger of Peace. She had received honorary degrees from universities around the globe. But on this particular evening, none of those accomplishments were on her mind. She sat in the dressing room of the same concert hall where her journey had begun so many decades ago. The room looked different now, renovated and modernized over the years. But when she closed her eyes, she could still see her 12-year-old self standing in the corner, clutching a violin case and trying to ignore the laughter of judges who had not yet learned to respect her. Tonight's concert was special. It was being billed as a celebration of 50 years in music. Famous musicians from around the world had gathered to perform alongside her. Former students whose careers she had launched were returning to honor their mentor. The concert hall was filled with people who had been touched by her music over the decades, from elderly fans who remembered her first performances to young children who had discovered her through her educational programs. Was not there. She had passed away 5 years earlier, peacefully in her sleep, knowing that her daughter had achieved more than either of them had ever dreamed possible. Still felt her mother's absence like a physical ache. She still reached for the phone to share good news before remembering that no one would answer. But she also felt her mother's presence in everything she did. Sacrifice and devotion had made everything possible. Her spirit lived on in every note played. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. A young woman entered, holding a small violin case. Recognized her immediately. It was the girl from the poor neighborhood who had asked to touch her violin all those years ago. Was now in her 30s, a successful violin teacher who had dedicated her life to helping children from backgrounds like her own discover the joy of music. "I hope I am not disturbing you," said. "I just wanted to see you before the concert." Rose and embraced her former student. "You could never disturb me. I am so glad you came." They sat together, two women whose lives had intersected at a crucial moment and had been enriched ever since. Told about her latest students, about the challenges of teaching in underfunded schools, about the small victories that made all the struggle worthwhile. Listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering advice. "You know," said, "I have a student right now who reminds me of myself when I first met you. She has so much anger and so little hope. But when she picks up the violin, something changes in her eyes. I think music might save her life, just like it saved mine." Smiled, remembering the girl she had once been. "Then you must give her everything you have, not just technique and theory. Give her your heart. That is what makes the difference." The conversation was interrupted by a stage manager announcing that it was almost time. Hugged one last time and went to find her seat in the audience. Was alone again with her thoughts and her violin. She picked up the instrument that had been her companion for half a century. It was not the same violin she had played as a child. That one was now in a museum, donated so that future generations could see the simple instrument that had carried such beautiful music. But this violin had been with her for 30 years, and it knew her secrets as well as any human being ever could. She walked toward the stage past photographs that lined the hallway. There she was as a child, holding her first trophy. There she was as a teenager, mid-performance at the famous gala concert. There she was as a young woman, shaking hands with world leaders. And there she was more recently, surrounded by children at a school visit, her face glowing with joy that fame could never provide. The applause that greeted her when she walked onto the stage was thunderous. The entire audience rose to their feet before she had played a single note. They were not just applauding her skill as a musician. They were applauding a life well lived, a legacy that extended far beyond concert halls, a human being who had used her extraordinary gift to make the world a little bit brighter. Stood at center stage and looked out at the sea of faces. She saw former teachers who had believed in her when she was young. She saw fellow musicians who had become lifelong friends. She saw students whose careers she had helped launch. She saw children from her educational programs, some now grown with children of their own. And in the front row, in the seat where judges had once sat and laughed at her name, she saw a young Japanese girl clutching a violin case, looking at the stage with wide eyes full of dreams. The orchestra began to play and lifted her bow. The music that poured from her violin that night was unlike anything she had ever produced before. It contained all her experiences, all her joys and sorrows, all her struggles and triumphs. It contained the memory of her mother's sacrifice and the hope she had planted in thousands of young hearts. It contained gratitude for the journey and peace with its inevitable end. She played not just for the audience present in the hall, but for everyone who had ever doubted her, for the judges who had laughed before they listened, for the critics who had questioned her during dark times, for the doubters who said a poor Japanese girl could never succeed in the Western classical music world. She played to show them that persistence and talent and love could overcome any obstacle. She played for her mother wherever her spirit might be. She tried to send a message through the music, the same way she had always done. She wanted to say thank you and I miss you, and I hope I have made you proud. She played for and all the children like her. She wanted them to know that their dreams were valid, their struggles were seen, their potential was limitless. She wanted them to understand that a violin was not just a wooden instrument with 4 strings. It was a key that could unlock doors to worlds they had never imagined. And finally, she played for herself, for the little girl who had practiced until her fingers bled, for the teenager who had refused to stop when the strings broke, for the young woman who had found the courage to step away and find herself, for the mother, teacher, humanitarian, and artist she had become. When the last note faded into silence, the audience sat in stunned stillness, just as they had at her very first performance so many decades ago. Then the applause began, building like a wave until it crashed over everything and everyone in the hall. People wept openly, not ashamed of their tears. They cheered until their voices went hoarse. They refused to stop clapping even when their hands began to ache. Bowed deeply, the Japanese way, just as she had done when she was 12 years old. Some things never changed, no matter how much success or fame came along. She was still the humble girl from Tokyo who believed that respect and gratitude were more important than any prize. As she straightened up and looked at the audience one last time, she caught the eye of the young Japanese girl in the front row. The child was crying, her small hands clutching her violin case as if it held all the dreams of her life. Smiled at her, a smile that contained 50 years of wisdom and encouragement. In that smile was a message that needed no words. I was once where you are now, and you will one day be where I am. The journey will be long and difficult, but it will be worth every step. Never let anyone's laughter stop your music. The girl nodded, understanding perfectly. The torch had been passed, the story would continue.